Nobody ever came to these sites with a clear idea of what they were searching for.
Cleopatra looked nothing like the legends have told you. And we don't have to guess, because the science is telling us. In January 2025, a study out of the University of Vienna demolished one of the most popular theories about Cleopatra's genetics. They used advanced DNA analysis on a skull that had been sitting in a university archive, unexamined for 7 decades. What they found didn't just challenge what she looked like. It also shattered a long-standing claim about who she was and where she came from. But do you know that the truly unsettling part isn't the study itself? It's what the study points back toward. A dynasty that practiced inbreeding so systematically, so relentlessly, that it was a slow-moving biological catastrophe. And Cleopatra sat at the end of that family tree. This is the story of what Cleopatra's DNA revealed. Let's get into it. The cold case lawyer. Before we get to the DNA, you have to understand the investigation that set it all in motion. Kathleen Martinez grew up in the Dominican Republic. She spent years practicing law as a defense lawyer, building court cases out of evidence everyone else had overlooked. She was convinced that the greatest unsolved cold case in history was Cleopatra's missing body. Every Egyptologist she read told her Cleopatra was buried near the royal palace in Alexandria. Her final resting place had long since sunk into the Mediterranean. Case closed. Martinez didn't accept that. As a defense lawyer, she was trained to look at the profile of the suspect, not just the established theory. Cleopatra had watched Rome swallow everyone who stood against it. She knew exactly what Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, would do with her body if he got hold of it. Roman generals didn't just defeat their enemies, they paraded them through the streets. A captured Egyptian queen would have been the ultimate victory trophy, dead or alive. So Martinez asked a different question. Not where Cleopatra is buried, but where would Cleopatra have wanted to be buried? The search for the answer to that question led her to a ruined temple called Taposiris Magna. It is about 30 miles west of Alexandria and largely ignored by Egyptologists for centuries. Martinez started digging there in 2005 and hasn't stopped since. Her team has been making incredible discoveries for more than 20 years. They have found a foundation plate dedicating the temple to the goddess Isis, hundreds of coins bearing Cleopatra's image, and also a necropolis containing more than 1,000 mummified remains. And in 2022, they uncovered one of the masterpieces of Egyptian architecture, a 4,300-foot-long tunnel that is cut out from solid rock. It runs from beneath the temple toward the coast. In 2025, a team led by the oceanographer Robert Ballard confirmed the existence of a sunken port at the very end of that tunnel's path, exactly in the direction where Martinez's theory said something important would be. The tomb itself still hasn't been found, but the physical evidence is building towards something. Martinez and her team continue to dig, but a separate trail of evidence had been running in parallel for years. It is pointing toward what Cleopatra might have looked like and what her genes might have been carrying, and it just got a dramatic new plot twist. The wrong sister. For decades, the story went like this. A skeleton is buried inside a famous octagonal tomb in the ancient Greek city of Ephesus. Today, Ephesus is in western Turkey. That skeleton, according to a hypothesis that gained enormous traction after 1990, was Arsinoe IV, the younger half-sister of Cleopatra VII. If true, it would have been an astonishing find. Cleopatra and Arsinoe were not close. They were rivals. When Cleopatra was pushed into exile by her younger brother, it was Arsinoe who stepped into the power vacuum. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, it was Arsinoe who led the military resistance against him. She managed to even trap Caesar himself inside the royal palace. She was a teenage girl running an army. When Caesar finally won, Arsinoe was captured, chained, and paraded through Rome in his victory procession. The Roman crowds actually wept for her, a young girl in shackles. That public sympathy saved her life temporarily. She was exiled to the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, one of the most sacred sites in the ancient world. She thought the holy ground would protect her. In 41 BC, Cleopatra persuaded her lover, Mark Antony, to prove it wouldn't. He sent assassins to the temple steps. The murder of a political exile on sacred ground was considered a scandal, even by Roman standards. Cleopatra had reasons to commit such an act. A surviving rival was always a risk. A dead one wasn't. The octagon tomb in Ephesus is architecturally linked to Egyptian design, which deepens the theory. The remains inside were initially assessed as belonging to a young woman of high status, around 20 years old. That matched Arsinoe's age at death. The location matched, and the timeline also matched. So for decades, academics and popular historians treated it as an established fact that the skeleton in the octagon was Cleopatra's sister. The problem was that the skull had been separated from the skeleton during excavation in 1929. It was carried off to Vienna and largely forgotten. Nobody had run advanced analysis on it since a preliminary study in 1953. In 2022, researchers from the University of Graz in Austria were looking for images of the skull for a book. They tracked it down in the archive of the University of Vienna's Department of Evolutionary Anthropology. They found it sitting in a box with a yellowed note that simply read, "Skull from Ephesus." That rediscovery triggered a full-scale modern investigation that would overturn almost everything the academic world thought it knew. The 2025 study. The team that took on the Ephesus skull was led by anthropologist Gerhard Weber at the University of Vienna. He was working alongside experts from the Austrian Academy of Sciences. They had tools that didn't exist back in the 1950s: micro-CT scanning, radiocarbon dating, and ancient DNA protocols. Using these, it is possible to extract genetic material from the densest part of the human skull, the petrous bone just behind the ear. This is also the most preserved part of the skull. The scanning work happened in December 2022. The DNA results were published in the journal Scientific Reports in January 2025. The skull was not Arsinoe IV. It was not a 20-year-old woman of Egyptian royal lineage. The DNA was unambiguous. There was a Y chromosome. The person buried in that prestigious, architecturally significant tomb in the heart of ancient Ephesus was a boy, specifically between 11 and 14 years old. Gerhard Weber described the moment of the Y chromosome result as a complete shock. Even with all the modern tools and the expectation of rigorous analysis, the team wasn't prepared for that answer. But the findings didn't stop there. The micro-CT scans revealed that this boy had been dealing with severe developmental disorders. His upper jaw was underdeveloped and misaligned. His skull showed significant asymmetry. The findings were consistent with Treacher-Collins syndrome, a rare genetic condition that affects the formation of facial bones. It can cause serious difficulties with basic functions like chewing and speaking. When they traced his genetic ancestry, it didn't lead back to Egypt. It led to the Italian peninsula, or Sardinia. So who was he? That question remains unanswered. The octagon is what's known as a heroun, a tomb built to honor a semi-divine or heroic figure, not an ordinary burial. Someone decided this boy deserved to be buried in one of the most architecturally prominent tombs in a major city. A deformed, chronically ill child from Italy was buried with extraordinary honors in an Egyptian-style monument in Turkey. There is no inscription, no name, and no explanation. It is a genuinely strange and unresolved mystery. What the study did close definitively was the Arsinoe question. She was not in Ephesus. Her actual burial site is unknown. And with her, we lost what we thought was our clearest genetic path to Cleopatra's bloodline. The octagon result means we still don't have Cleopatra's DNA. We have never had it. What we do have is her family tree, and it tells a disturbing story without needing a lab at all. A family that ate itself. The Ptolemies were a Macedonian Greek dynasty that conquered Egypt in the wake of Alexander the Great. They ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. To legitimize themselves to their Egyptian subjects, they adopted many local traditions. One of these local traditions was the pharaonic practice of royal marriage within the family. Over time, that practice escalated well beyond cousin marriages into something far more extreme. The pattern started in earnest with Ptolemy IV in the 3rd century BC, whose parents were half-first cousins. From there, each generation drew the circle tighter. Siblings married siblings. Uncles married nieces. Brothers took their own sisters as co-rulers and wives. By the time Cleopatra VII arrived, her family genetics had been collapsing in on itself for nearly 100 years. Scholars who have mapped the Ptolemaic genealogy describe what they call pedigree collapse, a state where the family tree doesn't branch outward into a wider network of ancestry. It folds back on itself repeatedly until many of the branches lead to the same source. In a healthy lineage, your DNA represents a combination of 2 very different genetic backgrounds. Your mother covers weaknesses your father doesn't have, and vice versa. This balance is what keeps recessive genetic problems from expressing themselves. When your parents are closely related, that balance disappears. The same genetic sequences appear on both sides. Flaws that would normally stay dormant start to dominate. The consequences of this can be tracked directly through dynasties that followed similar patterns. The Spanish Habsburgs are the most clinically documented case. Charles II of Spain, the last of the Habsburgs, had an inbreeding coefficient of around 25%. This means that roughly a quarter of his genes were identical by direct descent, rather than by chance. He couldn't speak until he was 4, and couldn't walk until he was 8. He had a jaw so malformed that his upper and lower teeth never touched. He died at 38. The autopsy record is one of the most disturbing documents in European medical history. In contrast, how severe was Cleopatra's situation? Since we don't have Cleopatra's actual genome, we have to look at the man who was her great-great-uncle, Ptolemy VIII. He is genetically one of Cleopatra's closest ancestors. His genome paints the most realistic and honest picture of what Cleopatra was fighting biologically. The Graves' disease theory. His name was Ptolemy VIII, and history remembered him by his nickname Physcon. In Greek, that means potbelly, and his contemporaries in Alexandria used it to mock him openly. Even today, he is commonly known as the Potbelly King. Ancient sources describe a man who was obese to such an extreme degree that his legs were too weak to support his own weight. He had to be helped from place to place by attendants. He was known for a bloated frame and a neck that historians describe as noticeably swollen. Historical accounts also note what sources describe as a peculiar prominence of the eyes. He was widely despised in Alexandria. He was famous not just for his appearance, but also for his violent cruelty toward political opponents and intellectuals. Those specific physical features taken together are markers that modern endocrinologists associate with Graves' disease, an autoimmune condition that attacks the thyroid gland and causes it to become overactive. Graves' disease produces a distinctive combination of weight changes and a goiter, or a visibly enlarged neck. Also, the characteristic eye protrusion called exophthalmos, where the eyes appear to bulge forward. It runs in families and has a known genetic component. Ancient writers did not write medical reports, but the pattern across multiple Ptolemaic rulers is striking enough that historians have continued to flag it. It raises a real question about what Cleopatra may have inherited. Ancient sources consistently praise Cleopatra's extraordinary energy. She worked continuously, charmed everyone in a room, spoke 9 languages, and ran a court. All this while managing 2 of the most powerful men in Rome simultaneously. Another thing historians and scholars agree on is Cleopatra's extraordinary command of medicine and chemistry. She was an authority on pharmacy in her time. But the link that no one has formed is that there is a high chance she studied medicine to manage her own biological problems. The first biohacker. Galen is one of the most influential medical writers of history. He is known for having cited a text on cosmetics and medicine that is attributed to Cleopatra. There are debates about whether Cleopatra VII was the author of that specific text, or whether it was written by a later physician who took the name Cleopatra. What is not debated is that Egypt had access to substances that were unavailable to the rest of the Mediterranean. Opium from poppy fields in the Thebaid region was one of the most powerful analgesics available at the time. Kifi, a complex ceremonial incense, is documented by the historians Plutarch and Dioscorides. It is made from a mixture of resins, herbs, and aromatic compounds, and is known specifically for its calming and sedative effects. The blue lotus, Nymphea caerulea, which ancient Egyptians used ritually. Modern research has confirmed that it contains mild psychoactive compounds producing states of calm and mild euphoria. If Cleopatra was dealing with the physical inheritance of her dynasty, she had access to a pharmacy that nobody else on Earth could match. The cosmetics and preparations she is known for developing weren't just about appearance. They were technology. The kohl that Egyptian royals used around their eyes had known antimicrobial properties. Elaborate jewelry and broad ceremonial collars could do more than project power. They could conceal a neck that had changed shape. They could reshape the visual presentation of a face that didn't match the goddess-queen image her political authority required. Ancient Egypt was unrivaled in its pharmacological knowledge at the time, and Cleopatra had very strong reasons to manage her public appearance with extreme care. The historical record of Cleopatra's actual presence also agrees with this point of view. It tells a completely different story from the one you have been told. Power without beauty. Here is the version of Cleopatra that gets passed down through Hollywood. A gorgeous woman of mystery whose power came from physical beauty. A seductress who manipulated men through attraction alone. The ancient sources themselves directly contradict this. The historian Plutarch wrote one of the most detailed accounts of her life. He said plainly that her beauty was not of the most striking kind. What drew people to her, he wrote, was the force of her character, the persuasiveness of her conversation, and a charm that was impossible to resist in her presence. Cassius Dio, a Roman historian, noted that she had a voice that was sweet to listen to, and that she could switch instantly between whatever language her audience spoke. That last detail is important. Cleopatra is reported to have spoken 9 languages. Greek was her first language, and the tongue of the Ptolemaic court. She also spoke Ethiopian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Median, Parthian, Arabic, and Latin. She was a queen who could speak directly to her own subjects in their native tongue. That was a different kind of power than beauty. It was strategic and built over the years. So, after everything you've just heard, where does that leave us, and what do we know now? What we know now. The January 2025 study changed the landscape of Cleopatra research significantly. The Ephesus skull was the only physical object in the world that had a legitimate claim to Ptolemaic genetics. The skull belonged to an Italian boy with Treacher-Collins syndrome. Arsinoe IV, Cleopatra's half-sister, is missing once again, and with her, the best candidate for a DNA match to Cleopatra's actual biological makeup. That leaves us in an interesting position. We know a great deal about the dynasty she came from. We know the pattern of inbreeding and the physical descriptions of her ancestors. We also know that she was a prominent pharmacologist and chemist who had every incentive to manage her own health and appearance. But intelligence, language, and force of character. What we don't know, and won't know until Kathleen Martinez or someone else finds what's left of her, is what Cleopatra actually looked like. However, the deeper question this research raises isn't what Cleopatra looked like. It's what it would mean to discover she was dealing with serious physical challenges throughout her life. And if this theory turns out to be true, it will make her even more impressive. The 2025 DNA study blew up the only genetic lead researchers had on Cleopatra's biology. A 2,000-year-old debate about her looks and her lineage is still wide open. And under a desert temple 30 miles west of Alexandria, a criminal defense lawyer is still digging toward what might be the most significant archaeological find in history. So, what do you think? When we finally find Cleopatra's tomb, will science confirm the legend from the stories, or are we about to meet someone history never showed us? Let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next mystery we dig into. We'll see you in the next one.